Hi and welcome to our final block of our block of the week for 2015, and the block today is Lemoyne Star. This one is a little bit different in that we have inset seams, Y seams, triangles, and squares both that are set into the block. But the first thing I want to go through is how you actually go ahead and cut the diamonds for this. These are equilateral, so we're going to be cutting rectangles that are 3 inches by 7 1/4. Then we're going to take and put the diagonal, the bias line of our ruler on the outside edge, lining up the point here, and we will cut the corner off. Then we'll slide down again on that outside edge. We're going to the point here and cutting the 45-degree angle there. That will give us 4 more diamonds, and I actually have 4 already cut. Then lay out the block the way you like. I have 8 different fabrics. Thing to remember with a Lemoyne Star, the more fabrics you have, the more critical your center seam is as far as whether it matches or not. If you have all one fabric, nobody's going to be able to tell if that doesn't match up or not. So you can decide how many different fabrics you want. So I'm going to be sewing this together in groups of 2, 2, 4, 6, 8. Then those 2 sets or 4 sets will go into 2 halves. These two are half, and then I'm going to sew my center seam. I will be finger pressing all of these seam allowances to one side. They will always go in the same direction. The reason I'm finger pressing is we always have 2 sides to these diamonds that are bias and 2 sides that are straight grain, and we want to limit the amount of stretching that can happen to the bias. So let me go ahead and sew these, and then we will do a Y seam with the triangle. Okay, so I have my Lemoyne Star put together as far as all my star points. I do want to show you that I have done a spinning of the center here, and if you will remember the way we do that, I have my center seam, I have a vertical seam here, and there are about 3 stitches in the seam allowance that I'm going to rip out on this side and on this side, and that will let me push 1 seam up and 1 seam down so that I have flattened that center and it's not nearly as bulky. Now we're ready to do our Y seams, and you'll also notice I've sewn all the way up on these. I'm not trying to start 1/4 inch back, I'm actually sewing the entire seam. So I will take one of my triangles. I always put my 4 triangles in first, followed by my squares, and the reason I do that is I have a point on my diamond that will match to the point on my triangle. So I will flip this up and match point to point. Then I will be sewing from the outside in down to the seam allowance, but not through it, and back stitching. Okay, let me move over here and do that. So I'm coming up to but not through, and I'm back stitching. Okay, now I have about 3 stitches right here on this seam that I'm going to take out, because right now if I try to move this over, it won't turn. It just causes a bubble here. So I want to release those stitches. So I'm taking right here and taking that stitch out. Now that seam releases, and I can flip this up. This time, last time I was looking at my diamond. This time I will be looking at my triangle because I now have stitches right here that I can use as a reference point for stopping. So I've matched up my points. Again, I'm going to sew from the outside in. And the reason I do that is because this is bias and it can stretch a little bit. And if you are going from the inside out, if the bias has moved on you, you won't know it until you get to the outside edge, and then it scoots past and you're not at a perfect point. Okay, so I've gone from the outside in, I've gone up to but not through, and I have back stitched. And because I'm working with the 1/4 inch seam on my sewing machine, this comes out perfect every time. So I'm going to bring this over here. So there is my point in, and again I will finger press. I am finger pressing everything until I get done with this. So I'm finger pressing that seam down. Okay, now what I will rotate around and put the other 3 triangles in, and what happens then when these get pressed down, I now have a squared off corner to put my squares in. If you try doing your squares first, let me bring over here, then you have to figure out how much beyond that square this triangle tip has to go. If you do the triangles first, matching point to point, press them down, I will trim out these little guys here, and now I have a squared off corner where I will match my square, and I'll do exactly the same thing, sewing from the outside in, back stitching, ripping out those 3 stitches, outside in, and back stitching. And I'm going to complete that, and then we'll come back and let you see the completed block. Okay, so my camera person informs me that I moved something out of the way, so we're going to inset one more time. So again, I have the point of my diamond matched to the point of my triangle, and the first time I sew, I am looking at my diamond because I already have a seam here that I can see, and I will be stitching up to, but not through that seam allowance, and back stitching. Okay. Now, if you look right here, there are 3 stitches above where these 2 seams intersect that I need to remove. So I'm going to pick this and pick this guy out. Okay, and that is going to let me flip this. It releases it so that the 2 pieces will now line up with each other. This time I'm looking at the triangle because I now have a seam that I've sewn to use as a reference point, and I will go from the outside in and go up to but not through my stitching, and again I'll back stitch. Okay, and again I will finger press this seam down and down in it just as a perfect inset every time, and I'll go finish the block. Okay, so I have my block done, all of my triangles inset, and all of my squares inset. And I have pressed all of those seams in or down, spun my center, and I pressed it after I got done piecing it. Finger pressed up into that point, because if you won't know until you put the very last square in, sewing the very last seam, whether you have stretched bias or not. And if you have stretched it too much, this center pokes up and it won't lay flat. So finger pressing is an important part of this particular block, and my center is laying nice and flat, and I hope yours is successful also, and we will see you next week.